I've told this story more times than I can count, but I've never written it down. Maybe I avoided putting it to paper because part of me still can't believe it happened. But after all these years, I'm starting to think getting it out of my head might help. I don't know. What I do know is that I've never been back to the woods since, and I don't plan to. Ever. It was about 20 years ago. I was 16, and my dad thought it was time I learned how to hunt properly. We'd been out together a few times when I was younger, but this trip was different. This was a full weekend, just me and him, camping deep in the woods up north. He picked a spot miles from any trails or cabins, just the two of us and whatever we could catch. We packed light, drove to the edge of the forest, and hiked in for hours until we found a clearing to set up camp. I remember it being cold, colder than it should have been for early October. The sun was already low by the time we finished setting up the tent, so we built a fire and cooked up some beans. That first night was quiet, just the usual forest sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the crackling fire. Dad was a quiet man, didn't talk much unless he had something to say. But that night, as we sat around the fire, he told me stories. Mostly about when he was my age, hunting with his dad. I think he was trying to pass on something to me, a connection, maybe. It was nice. Peaceful. The next morning, we got up early and started tracking. The forest was thick, dense with trees and underbrush. After a few hours of hiking, we spotted some fresh deer tracks. Dad got this look in his eye, like he was locked in. We followed those tracks deeper into the woods, far from our campsite. The forest felt different the further in we went, darker, quieter. The kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Around midday, we reached a small ravine, and that's when everything went to hell. We stopped at the edge, scanning for signs of the deer, when I heard something, this weird, low groan, almost like the wind but not quite. Dad heard it too. He raised his hand to signal me to stop. We stood there, perfectly still, listening. The groan came again, but this time it was closer. And then, out of nowhere, we heard something moving in the trees across the ravine. It wasn't a deer. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate, like something big was walking through the brush. I looked at Dad, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. "Get down," he whispered, crouching low. I followed his lead, pressing myself to the ground, my heart hammering in my chest. We stayed like that, hidden, watching. Whatever it was getting closer. I could see the trees swaying, branches snapping under its weight. And then, it stepped into view. It wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a deer. The thing was tall, maybe 8 feet or more, its body thin and emaciated, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its skin was gray, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes, those eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. The worst part was its face. It looked almost human, but distorted, twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. Its mouth hung open, sharp, jagged teeth exposed, and from that mouth came the groan, the sound of pure hunger. It was a Windigo. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. I've read enough since that day to be sure. The creature sniffed the air, its head turning slowly, like it was searching for something. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't look our way. But then it did. Those empty eyes locked onto us, and it let out this horrible, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. Dad grabbed my arm, yanking me up. "Run," he hissed, and we bolted. We scrambled back through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the ground uneven beneath our feet. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the trees, faster than anything that size should have been. My lungs were burning, my legs shaking, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, we reached a ridge, and without thinking, we slid down the slope, tumbling into a creek at the bottom. I hit the water hard, gasping as the cold shocked my system. Dad was beside me, his face pale, his eyes wide. We scrambled to the other side of the creek, hiding behind a fallen tree, trying to catch our breath. For a moment, everything was silent. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the sound of the water rushing by. Then, we heard it again, that groan, that awful, inhuman sound, echoing through the trees. It was still looking for us. We stayed there, crouched behind that log for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the sounds faded. The Windigo must have lost our scent. But we didn't move. Not until the sun started to set. Dad grabbed my arm again, his voice low, but steady. "We're leaving. Now." We made our way back to camp in silence, packed everything up as fast as we could, and hiked out under the cover of darkness. Neither of us spoke the entire way back to the truck. We didn't need to. We both knew what we saw. I haven't been in the woods since. I can't. Every time I even think about going back, I remember that thing's eyes, the sound of its growl, and I feel that cold, gnawing fear in my gut. Dad never talked about it after that day. He didn't have to. We both knew what we saw, and that was enough. I don't know if anyone will believe this, but I had to tell it. Maybe someone else out there has seen it, too. If you have, you'll know I'm telling the truth. If not, well, I hope you never do. Stay out of the woods. Trust me, it's not worth the risk.